having done some research on the Red Sea crossing, they started out with about 75 going to Egypt and went through a number of years. About 215 years, 430 total, 215 in Canaan and 215 in Egypt. And so only had 215 years to go from 75 to over 2 million people. How is that possible? So let's take a look. Is it feasible, given certain circumstances and God's supernatural superintending, both working together? It's quite plausible. So Red Sea crossing. Red Sea. Let's take a look at Red Sea. Israel, Moses. I did a population chart. Estimated population growth. Estimated population growth of ancient Israel in Egypt, 215 years. Okay, so we have each couple estimated to have an average of one child every 2 years over a period of 28 childbearing years. Population was everything in those days. Whole families became armies after a number of years. Childbearing ages 16 to 44, 14 total children per couple, translates to an average of one child per individual every 4 years, with an average lifespan of 100 years per individual. So we start with 1, accumulated total 2. 1 kid, total 2. And take a look at the top headings here. So, how many generations? So we have a total, accumulated total, as you see, average of one child every 2 years, over a period of 28 years of childbearing. So you accumulate after 4 years, see, after 4 years, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and then you start to have children having children, and then grandchildren having children, and so on, as we go all the way down. We have 100 years. We have a couple of deaths, too, so we go to the estimated number of years people have to die, and we have only so many people from the age of childbearing years, 16 to 44. So, first 100 years, the accumulated total only just under 2,000. But wait, it escalates. We go to 200 years, right about here. We have some deaths and births, lots of births. 43, all of a sudden, 120,677 in 200 years. Okay? And then we have the average number of descendants per individual in 216 years. 194,838. 200,000 people in 216 years. Okay? Per individual. Was that multiplied by plausible number of Israelites at Exodus in year 215? 2,350,056. See, so you have Stephen reports his historical narrative, summary of Joseph and the rest of the fathers, the patriarchs of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. A famine and a great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers, in the sense of the sons of Jacob, from whom the 12 tribes of Israel were descendants, found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out his fathers first, referring to his sons, who were the fathers of the tribes of Israel, the 12, in the sense of being their firstborns. And on the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. And Joseph, having sent, did call for his father Jacob and all his kindred. So come on over to Egypt, Joseph said, with 75 souls. So only 75 started out, and we have the 75 exploding into over 2 million Israelites by virtue of that chart, if that's the case. They had no wars, so there it was. There's the chart. Do your own chart. Each couple estimated to have an average of one child every 2 years over a period of 28 childbearing years, ages 16 to 44. Then no more childbearing after that. 14 total children per couple. This translates to an average of one child per individual every 4 years, with an average lifespan of 100 years per individual. And you had some minuses. After 100 years, people started dying off. See right here, some minuses. And the minuses got bigger and bigger, but the population got huge. So one individual, one couple actually, resulted in almost 200,000 people over 216 years, or 215 years of childbearing, and at the age of 14 to 40. So that's what we got, 2,350,000 years. Now, here's the point. In Acts 17:17, Stephen is recounting the history of the Jews, and according to as the time of the promise, Stephen said, was gnawing high, which God did swear to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, till another king rose, who had not known Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them cast out their babies, so that they might not live. Note the Lord's promise to Abraham that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land and be in bondage for 400 years, but after that they would come out of that land and serve the Lord in the promised land, to which Stephen referred to in Acts 7:6-7. This included Israel coming out with great possessions, whereupon Stephen testified to the Sanhedrin court that the prosperity of Israel and Egypt continued, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. And this man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them cast out their babies so that they may not live. Hence many were killed by being cast into the Nile River. This statement implies that the new king was not closely connected with the previous pharaoh, but Joseph's accomplishments in Egypt were legendary. This evidently implies that the rulers of Egypt were most likely not Egyptian. Hence the new king was most likely one of the Hyksos kings, who descended from Semitic foreign invaders. They were actually related peoples to the Hebrews. They did not use Egyptian hieroglyphic writing on their scarabs, and they, like the Israelites, were Semites. They ruled over Egypt for a time, about 1730 to 1570 BC, and would not know of Joseph, being a Jew, had died earlier. The Hyksos kings controlled Egypt by a military force which was much smaller in numbers than the native population, including the Hebrews, causing Pharaoh's hostility. This Hyksos conquering military ruler toward the growing population of the Hebrews, which is stipulated in the next two verses, a perceived threat to his rulership. This is a testimony to the large population of Israel. Marvelous things he did in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the land of Zoan. Note that Zoan is the famous Egyptian city of Tanis, built by Hyksos about 1700 BC, which indicates that a Hyksos king was ruler of Egypt at the time of Moses and the Exodus. And he said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." So that's a testimony of the large population of Israel. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. Pharaoh was motivated in preserving his own power, as well as in Israel's brick production and building program. He was most likely one of the Hyksos kings who ruled over Egypt via a military occupation force that was not as large as the native population or Israelite population. Hence he was paranoid about the rapidly growing Hebrew population joining forces in an uprising or invasion force. The word afflict in verse 11 implies forced labor for the Israelites in the Nile River Delta, where Pithom and Ramses were located. This cruel and deadly oppression of a people was and is most common over all the ancient and present-day world in order to reduce them as a threat to the ruling powers, especially a large group of people like Israel. On the other hand, the people were a valuable resource as forced labor to build fortifications and supply cities such as Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more Israel multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, in the sense of being harsh toward them. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick and in all manner of services in the field. All their services in which they were made served was with rigor. But the greater the affliction, the more the Israelite population increased, which in turn caused the rulers of Egypt to dread the Israelites turning against them in battle, causing an even greater and more oppressive workload on the people of Israel. Some contend that they were so bitter toward the Israelites they reduced the population, but it actually went totally the opposite. So then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. This king was probably not one of the Hyksos kings who descended from foreign invaders and ruled over Egypt for a time, but Thutmose, who continued the abusive enslavement of the Israelites of his predecessors. This new pharaoh, although native Egyptian, was just as disturbed by the rapid population growth of the Hebrew colony as the Hyksos rulers were. Hence, they persecuted them even more, especially in light of having been oppressed themselves by the Hyksos foreigners, and finally were able to oust them. Furthermore, Egyptians had been increasingly hostile toward the Hebrews since they arrived in Egypt in Joseph's time, centuries earlier, largely due to religious and cultural differences. The Hebrews, so far as they were concerned, were despicable blasphemers of their gods. So, Exodus 1:16, and he said, "And when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live." So the Egyptian king resorted to infanticide by attempting to get the Israelite midwives to murder newborn males. The two women named Shiphrah and Puah, Semitic and not Egyptian names, was evidently the administrators of all the midwives of Israel. The context implies that the midwives were largely, if not all, Jewish, for they are described as fearing the God of Israel. For when they all refused to kill the newborn male babies, therefore not disturbing the population growth of Israel to any extent. Pharaoh intimated in verse 22 that he would use his own people, the Egyptians, to carry out the infanticide of Israel, newborn male babies. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them." Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. So God supernatural superintending as well. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. But the midwives did not obey the king's instructions. Verse 17 declared that they feared God, implying that they were most likely Israelite, and acted accordingly. They did not murder any newborn males. And when the king questioned them, they made the excuse that the Israelite women were so lively that they gave birth before the midwives could get to them. It was particularly true, I think. This implies that every one of the newborn male children was hidden from the midwives before they could get there, hence none of them could be killed. Their answer to the king, however, was suspicious because it was wholly inadequate in explaining their massive failure to not kill even one male newborn, maintaining that they were late at every single birth, missing every birth to the extent that every newborn male child was successfully hidden from them before they even got there. Yet no punishment was forthcoming from the king. God evidently protected and dealt well with the midwives, providing households for them, an extraordinary thing for women in those times, implying that they were blessed with children as well. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." So the king of Egypt ordered for all of his people, all those living in Egypt, to cast newborn Jewish males into the river Nile. So even the parents of newborn sons were ordered to put to death, or they could be themselves be put to death. So, at the time of Israel's great persecution in Egypt by a king who had not known Joseph, Moses was born. He was brought up in his father's house for 3 months, and then finding him exposed out on the Nile by Moses, his mother's design and the providence of God, the daughter of Pharaoh found him, took him up, and reared him as her son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds. When he was 40, it came upon his heart to look after his brethren, the sons of Israel. Out of vengeance, he killed an Egyptian who was persecuting the Israelite. Moses thought that his brethren understood his motive of giving them deliverance from Egypt's oppression, but they did not understand that. And so the next day, when Moses intervened between two fighting Israelites, they denied that he was appointed ruler over them, and confronted him with his killing of the Egyptians, as if Moses would kill them too. Knowing that his murderous action was so well known, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian,